In this week's In-Ear Insights, this is part two, I guess the cliffhanger resolution from last week's episode on generative analytics. So we talked last week about generative analytics, the use of generative AI tools to enable your analytics data, because we've been sitting around for decades with data and it just sits there. We do nothing with it. Generative AI tools give us the ability to give this data to tools and then have them tell us, so what and now what? But Katie, you said at the end of last week's episode, therein lies the challenge, thinking to ask a question, knowing what to ask the machine so you're getting the right information. You said, I think a lot of us have already made the assumption, well, it's generative AI, it must have the right answer. How do we find out before we give them all of our data? How do we find out whether or not it even has the right information or the right knowledge so that we can use it to do insightful analysis?
Yeah, and I stand by those questions. And it's interesting. It's not just for generative analytics. It's really for anything. But if we focus in on generative analytics, my concern is, or, my question is, so if you're going to start using large language models to help you with your analysis and insights, how do you know it's right? And this goes back to something we always talk about, is you have to have some kind of subject matter expertise in order to validate that the machines are giving you the right information. And that's not something you can just wake up and be like, oh, and I'm a subject matter expert. Those are things that take a long time, a lot of practice, a lot of, making mistakes, a lot of trial and error, and just a lot of experience. And so I think what I'm concerned is going to happen is that, companies maybe don't have the budget or aren't willing to spend the budget on an analytics team, on a data analyst, on data governance, whatever the thing is. And they're just going to feed their data into a large language model and say, what is this telling me? And they're not going to have a way to say, you know what, that doesn't seem right. Or how do I know that this is correct? They're not going to do those validation checks. And so I guess, what can we do? So let's say we don't have an analyst on our team and we're going to rely on generative AI to help us with our analytics. We're going to do generative analytics. What can we do to prime the model to validate that it knows what it's talking about if I'm not an analytics expert? And I think that's the challenge.
Okay, so here's the big challenge. Today's language models, even the very best ones, if you use just the model itself, they can't do math at all. Well, if you want to try, this is something I saw Rebecca over on LinkedIn. I shared this. Ask any language model how many R's are in the word strawberry. They will rarely, if ever, get the answer correct, which is 3.
Yeah, I was mentally, I was like 1, 2, 3.
and they will say 2, 4, 5 for a very, very simple task like that. And the reason that's happening is because the models can't see letters. They can only see tokens. This is relevant when it comes to analytics and generative analytics, because when you load data into a model, it is seeing numbers as essentially pieces of words. And so it's looking at the massive, statistical correlations to see what things it's seen like that in the past. Now, today's generation of models is much smarter than it was 2 years ago when ChatGPT first came out, as an example, but they still can't fundamentally count. The way model makers have gotten around that is by adding in hidden pieces, sometimes hidden, sometimes not, pieces of code. So if you use Gemini and turn on code execution, if you use Llama 3.1, if you use ChatGPT, you will see them start writing Python code in the background. They'll say, hey, I see you loaded a spreadsheet. I'm going to write Python code to interpret this spreadsheet and then process the data that way. That is how they get around not being able to count. But that approach too is not necessarily the right one all the time, because they're trying to guess at the analysis you want to run and then write the appropriate code for it. So it's a very long way of answering the question that these tools do need subject matter expertise. There is no getting around that. If you don't have someone who's got data governance skills, you are flying blind and hoping the tool is sophisticated enough to invoke the right tool usage within itself to come up with the answer. One thing you should do anytime you're doing these analytics is do a little canary trap, which is you give it a problem that you know the answer to, and you see how well it interprets it, right? So if you were to export, Katie, our Google Analytics data, and you know what happened in our company, you would give it a table to analyze. You would see what conclusion it comes up with, and you would validate, well, yeah, you did not read that table. Like, you don't understand what the actual task I'm trying to have you do. Or it does read the table and go, okay, I can see that. Generally speaking, they can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. More complex things than that, they have to invoke Python, and then you're into a territory of, do you know how to solve that problem without AI?
Well, so I feel like that answers my question of, can you use these large language models to do analytics? And the answer is not if you don't have a subject matter expert on your team, because I think that's one of the misconceptions about generative AI is that it can do math. And so I think I'm generalizing now. I think there's an association with computing, because it's computers, it's technology, the word compute, and generative AI. I think they're lumped into the same category of, well, it's generative AI, it's technology, it computes, therefore it must be able to handle statistics and, analysis and all these other things. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that is absolutely not the case. That is a misconception. But what generative AI can do is write code that would then do the computing. But then you need to be able to execute the code. And I think that's the other step that perhaps is missing is it'll write code, but then the code just sits there unless you actually know how to execute the code. So it's like, all right, so, ChatGPT, I have 2 spreadsheets and I need to find, the statistical significance between, these things. It's going to start to write code. And it might give you a response, but you don't know if that response is correct until you can check the code. And you probably want to take the code out of that system just to check it, to run it. I can see you're about to disagree with me, and that's fine. But basically, it sounds like the code is the key to generative analytics. And what you then do with that code is going to make the difference as whether or not it's a workable system to, quote unquote, replace a true analyst on your team.
You are mostly correct. The tools can execute the code as well. So ChatGPT does this. It will run Python code. Gemini does this. Anthropic Claude does this. However, to your point, just because they can run the code does not mean it's correct. You will actually see ChatGPT sometimes screw up 6 or 7 times in a row, even just trying to load Python packages that don't exist because it hallucinated them, or can't run in the environment that OpenAI has set up for them. So that's an issue. But you also said something really important, which is that generative AI is the language branch, the language and image branch there's an outgrowth of traditional AI, classical AI, stuff like regression analysis and classification. Those branches can do math because they are entirely math. Generative AI under the hood is also entirely math, but that's a topic for another conversation. And as a result, even if you have experience in traditional machine learning, you can get you can cross the streams, if you will, and believe that what the tool is creating is mathematically sound, and it may not be. Something, for example, as predictive analytics, for example, saying here's some trend data, forecast this trend. If you do that in ChatGPT, it will write forecasting code, whether or not it runs. But if you don't know forecasting methods like ETS and ARIMA and stuff, it may produce a forecast and you're like, well, it forecasted it. I have no idea if it made the right choice or not based on the code it wrote.
So I see a lot of people have been talking about predictive analytics as one of the use cases for generative AI. But is that then not really a great use case of generative AI for the casual user like myself?
That's an important clarification. Generative AI tools, the Transformers model, is fantastic at predictive analytics, but not for the casual user. And the reason
Mm,
for that is there are special models that are trained only to do time series forecasting. Lag Llama is an example of one of those. They are not for the traditional user, the typical user, because you have to download the model, you have to put it in a Docker container, and then you have to execute the Python code around it to do the forecasting. It's very accurate forecasting. It's very good forecasting, but it is not for the casual user, unless the casual user happens to be an IT person.
So let's assume the casual person is not. So, I like to talk about the casual user because I feel like that represents the majority of the population. So you have if you think about athletics, you have elite athletes, you have people who play professional sports. That is such a small percentage of the people overall who work out, who run, who play sports. And so it's not a fair assumption to assume that when we talk about generative AI and generative analytics, that we're all going to be power users. The majority of us are going to be casual users. We're going to be people who essentially scratch the surface, get some things done, maybe can do some advanced technical stuff, but for the most part, we're going to leave that to the experts. We're going to leave that to the people who are in that elite group who really understand how the machines work. So when I think about generative analytics and the casual everyday user, what questions do we need to be asking in order to get the systems to work for us?
Should you even be doing this with generative AI? Is question number one. Like, is the task itself suited for generative AI? I was having a chat with a friend over the weekend. She wanted to use Google's Gemini to help her build a calendar, build a schedule based on a bunch of inputs. It's really bad at that because calendaring and scheduling is not a language task. It is a symbolic logic task, right? Okay, does this task fit within this time frame? Does the task overlap with another task and things? It's the tools are not designed to do symbolic logic. They're designed to do language. So the first thing you should be looking at with generative analytics is, am I approaching this as a language task, or is this a mathematics or a statistics task? A good chunk of generative analytics is a language task. Like, here's the results, right? Basic numbers. Write a report, right? Draw some conclusions, infer what the strategy might be from this information. Those are language tasks, and they are well suited for that. But perform an ARIMA analysis, do a chi-squared test. That is not a language task. And so the first thing you have to do is, unsurprisingly, pull out the 5 Ps, and part of the 5 Ps is in the purpose. Is the task itself suited for generative AI?
Well, if you're talking about using the 5 Ps, the first thing you want to start with is, because you're talking about a platform, so generative AI being the platform, you want to clearly define the problem you're trying to solve. Forget the technology, forget the platform for a minute. So, the problem I'm trying to solve, the purpose of me doing this is to expedite report writing, to use your example. So, I have data, I need to write a report, I have no time. So, the purpose is to write reports faster, period. Forget about the technology, because as soon as you include the technology in the purpose, you're already biased to that solution and you do not explore other solutions. And I think that's where, as you go through the 5P exercise, you'll figure out, this is where I can when you get to process and platform, you'll figure out, can I use generative AI? Should I use generative AI? Or do I just need to hire, you know, someone super part-time to just write this stuff up? Or do I just need to suck it up and do it myself because it is the best option and I need to prioritize my time better? And so I would say the slight alteration, Chris, to your statement is, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Period. Leave the technology out of your purpose statement, because that's just going to set you up for failure.
Okay, so let's say I have. We'll just use a public example. Let's say I'm doing this month's reporting on the Save Warrior Nun campaign, and I have a big pile of data. My purpose is I need to crank out this report as quickly as possible because I ain't getting paid to do this stuff.
Mhm.
So that's the purpose. The people is me. How would you think about this? Like, I've got all this social data and news coverage data and all these spreadsheets. How are you going to tackle this as the typical user?
So the first questions I would start to ask is, so your purpose, it's to expedite the reporting. The people sounds like it's you, but it's also who's the end user, who's getting the report. What do they need from the data? So that's where you do your user story. So as the recipient of this information, I need to understand how we're doing on social so that, and if they don't have a reason for looking at this data other than it's nice to know, I immediately throw that off the table because it's like, all right, well, now it's just a waste of time because you can go look at it yourself. I don't need to be generating reports for you so that you can just, okay, cool. Like, that's not a good use of anybody's time. Um, but if they say so that I can change what we're doing, I can make decisions, I can take an action, then you can say, all right, well, this is important for the following reasons. So that sort of, and that becomes like your KPI map of like, I need to know the following things because it leads to my goal. So anyway, so you have your purpose. I need to expedite these reports. You have your people, you being the person executing it, and the feedback from the people receiving the reports. So the next step is you want to outline your process. So what are you doing week over week to complete these reports? So you're pulling data from social media, you're pulling data from email newsletters, you're pulling, conversation data from a community platform, and you're compiling all of it. And how long does that take? And how many different tools in the stack are you using? And then you look at, so you have your process and platform is sort of combined in that sense. And that's where you can take a step back and go, does what I'm doing fall under one of the categories of use cases of generative AI? Is that an option? And the answer in this case is yes. Summarization is a really great tool. Rewriting, classification, those are all things that you're likely doing yourself with the data. So you're not saying analyze this data to be statistically significant, find the chi-square, do the ARIMA. You're basically compiling everything and making one general report to say this is everything and this is the output. Then you can say, okay, I know that now that I know my process, I know where I can insert generative AI into it. The performance is using generative AI, making it faster. Are the solutions that I'm choosing expediting the reporting, which was my original purpose, is I need to expedite reporting. So that's sort of how you go through it. So you don't say, I need to expedite my report with generative AI. It's, I need to expedite my report, period. And then you go through the other pieces to figure out what are my options and solutions. And then once you start trying those solutions, you can measure the performance to say, did I solve the problem? Was this the right solution?
Yep. And in this particular example, there is no generative AI answer for the actual processing of the data. There is not, because it's so unwieldy and requires so much mathematical transformation first.
Mm-hmm.
What can be done is and this is we do this for all of our clients. We build the code to process the data first, transform it into a format that generative AI can then understand easily, and then use generative AI to actually generate the report. So it's not, you can't just hand it off to a language model, right? You have to do the processing first in classical AI, and then generative AI can take over. And that kind of becomes the umbrella of generative analytics. Is you have statistics, you have classical machine learning, and then you have generative AI in sort of almost like a supply chain of of data, right? It goes from your data source and extraction to statistical processing to classical machine learning to generative AI as like an assembly line almost. And value chain is generative analytics.
So I asked you the question of what does the casual user need to know? And so, I think what they need to know is what their process is. I mean, honestly, I don't want to say it's the key to success, but it's the key to success with using generative AI, with using classical AI. It's understanding and clearly defining your process, because then you can figure out where these technologies fit in, where they can replace. And so you want to find those spots in your process that are highly repeatable and consistent, where the output is 100% clear and defined. And so let's say that you've used classical AI or, code or even just a spreadsheet to clean up your data. So now it's in a readable format. I would venture a guess to say then, once the data is clean, your process is to take the data, draw some conclusions, write the report, summarize it. Like that is the consistent part. You know what's supposed to happen. That's where you can say, okay, maybe this is where I can insert generative AI into my process to expedite my reports.
Yes. In a lot of ways, it's almost like supply chain mapping. Right? If you do supply chain mapping, you chart out every step of your supply chain, from where you source your raw materials from, to the trucking companies and logistics companies that move it from the raw materials to a processor. The processor turns it into precursors. The precursors turn it into product. The product then gets trucked to distribution centers, and that goes to retail stores. And you have that whole long supply chain, and every step along the way has to be documented out, because you need to know you need to know what's going on. You really should. And B, for at least enterprise companies, you need business continuity plans for every step of that process. Because if, I don't know, a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal for 2 weeks, part of your supply chain is broken, and you need to have alternate ways to deal with that problem to keep the rest of your supply chain from grinding to a halt. The same thing is true with generative analytics. Exactly what you're saying, Katie. You diagram out the process from beginning to end, your generative analytics value chain, and you say, okay, here's where my data starts. It starts in Google Analytics or Talkwalker or Brand24. That data moves into here. It gets processed by a piece of code. That the piece of code then hands it off to another piece of code to be run through statistical analysis or regression analysis. That then gets transformed into markdown tables that get handed to generative AI. Generative AI writes the reports. Then the reports get handed to a client. That's your generative analytics value chain, and you've got to map that out. And if you don't map that process out, to your point, you don't know where generative AI fits and doesn't fit, because you don't know what's a language task and what's not. But B, you don't know where your data is going and where it's from. And that's a business risk above and beyond just whether or not you should use generative AI. My business might actually grind to a halt because I have no idea what's going on.
Well, spoiler, we can help with that. But that's a lot of what I spend my time doing is documenting what the heck is happening. But it's not just, here's the thing. In my experience, people don't like to document process because they feel like it slows things down. They're like, oh, process for process sake. And why do I have to document it? I just need to do it. Well, that's all well and good until it stops working. And then you don't know where in the process things broke down. And so if you yourself are not willing to do it, bring on a company like ours to do it for you, so that when you say, I need to be smarter, faster, better, cheaper, whatever the thing is, I need to increase my profit margins. I need to, pay my people more money because we're producing more work. I need to have AI services, whatever the problem statement is. We're always going to start with, all right, so what are you currently doing? What does that look like? What is your process? Because introducing new things without evaluating what's currently happening is just going to create more problems. You might get those quick wins. You might have that short-term success, but it's not sustainable. And the same is true with using something like generative AI for your analytics. You can throw all of your data into the system, but you don't know if what's coming back out is useful, valuable, correct, repeatable, scalable, more efficient. You have to do that process documentation first. I will die on that hill.
And if you do the process mapping, you're also going to find out the consequences of generative AI. So in the generative analytics value chain, if part of your chain says, hey, we review all of our client reports and and provide feedback, and then we hand it off to the client, that's a perfectly sensible thing to do. If you swap in generative AI to one of those stages, normally you have a workflow that says, the report is done on this day, it's handed off to the manager for review on this day, and then it goes to the client on this day. If generative AI suddenly says, hey, here's 28 client reports all the same day, now you have a problem. You have a clog in your value chain, right? In your generative analytics value chain, you have this big bulge of stuff that now you're like, okay, well, our manager now has to be out of commission for 3 days to review all 28 reports that happened at the exact same time. So even if the workload remains the same, the timing of the workload matters, and you have to have that documented, because if you don't, you'll be very surprised. I see this happen with content creation. People are like, oh, I can use generative AI to write 10,000 blog posts. Yes, but your approvals process hasn't changed. Therefore, you now need to hire 48 new editors because you created 10,000 blog posts for them to review.
Let me tell you what would not make me happy is getting surprised by all of this work that generative AI created. And that's exactly it. Like, you have to think about, if you're putting generative AI in your process, you need to think about what's bookending it. And that's usually the human related pieces. What does that do? How does that change what the human has to do? And so, Chris, like, you'll create generative AI outputs of, scopes of work, of content. I still have to go through and read it. And how many times do I go back and ask you, did you write this or did generative AI write this? Because, and the reason I ask you that is not to be like, don't do that, like, not to be a scold, but it helps me think through how much more cognitive load I need to attach to this thing to review it. Because if you wrote it, you, the human, then I know how you write. I know how you think about things. If generative AI wrote it, I need to take a different lens because there's going to be more nuance to how to make corrections. And so for me as a human, it changes my ask. It changes my workload if you wrote it or if generative AI wrote it. And it might be a matter of 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes add up over time.
Exactly. If you've got some thoughts about generative analytics and how you're incorporating generative AI into your analytics process, or into, frankly, any of your value chains, and you want to share those stories, pop on over to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,500 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is that you watch or listen to the show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on, you can find it at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, where you can see our podcast is in places that mostly serve podcasts. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.